If you've ever been told you weren't good enough, that your body or your mind made you less than others, that you should accept limitations and stay quiet in the shadows, then hit that subscribe button right now. This is a story of a woman who was labeled unfit for life itself, yet she became the lifeline for 23 innocent souls. Stay until the end, and you'll discover how the very thing they said made her weak became her greatest strength. Her name was Ruth Eisenberg, and in the winter of 1938, she was 26 years old, living in Vienna, Austria, a city that had once been the jewel of Europe, but had become a place where people like her were no longer considered human. She was born with a condition that the doctors called poliomyelitis, polio, a disease that had ravaged her left leg when she was just 4 years old, leaving it withered and weak, forcing her to walk with a pronounced limp and rely on a wooden cane that had become as much a part of her as her own shadow. In a world that was increasingly obsessed with physical perfection, with the idea of a master race of strong, healthy, beautiful people, she was everything they despised. She was Jewish. She was disabled. And according to new laws that were being written, she was unfit to exist. Vienna in 1938 was a city transformed by hatred. The Vienna of Ruth's childhood, the city of Mozart and Strauss, of grand coffee houses and elegant boulevards, of intellectual salons and artistic brilliance, had been consumed by something dark and terrible. When Germany annexed Austria in March of that year, in what they call the Anschluss, the unification, the streets erupted not in protest but in celebration. Ruth watched from her window as her neighbors, people she had known her entire life, poured into the streets waving swastika flags, cheering for Hitler, their faces twisted with joy that made her blood run cold. Within days, the persecution began. Jewish shops were marked with yellow stars and the word Jude painted across their windows. Jewish professors were expelled from universities. Jewish doctors were forbidden from treating non-Jewish patients. And Jewish children were expelled from schools, sent home with notes explaining that they were contaminating the pure Aryan students. Ruth lived in the Leopoldstadt district, the second district of Vienna, which had historically been home to a large Jewish population. Her apartment was on the third floor of a building on Taberstrasse, a street lined with chestnut trees that in spring would bloom with white flowers like candles. But in that winter 1938, the trees were bare and skeletal, their branches reaching toward a gray sky that seemed to press down on the city like a lid on a coffin. The building was old, built in the late 19th century, with high ceilings and ornate moldings that spoke of a more elegant time. But the elegance was fading. The paint was peeling. The carpets were worn, and there was a smell of cabbage and despair that permeated the hallways. Ruth lived with her mother, Sarah, who was 53 and worked as a seamstress, her finger perpetually pricked and scarred from needles, her eyes strained from years of close work in dim light. Ruth's father had died 5 years earlier from a heart attack, leaving them with little money and fewer prospects. Her mother took in sewing work from whoever would hire her, which was becoming increasingly difficult as Jewish businesses closed and non-Jewish clients refused to associate with them. They survived on thin soups and black bread, on potatoes and occasionally an egg. The cold was constant, coal was expensive, and they rationed it carefully, wearing layers of clothing indoors, sleeping under every blanket they owned. Before the Anschluss, Ruth had worked as a teacher at a Jewish school, teaching literature and languages to children aged 10 to 14. She loved teaching, loved watching young minds open to new ideas, loved the way a child's face would light up when they finally understood a difficult concept. She spoke German, of course, but also French and English, which her father had insisted she learn, saying that languages were keys that could open doors to other worlds. She had studied at the University of Vienna before her disability, and her religion made it impossible to continue. But she had continued to read voraciously, to educate herself, to believe that knowledge was a form of freedom that no one could take away. When the school was closed in April 1938, Ruth found herself without purpose, without income, without hope. She spent her days in her small apartment, reading the same books over and over, listening to her mother's sewing machine clatter in the next room, watching through the window as the world outside became increasingly hostile. Jewish people were being attacked in the streets, beaten by gangs of young men in brown shirts who laughed as they kicked and punched. Jewish businesses were being confiscated, their owners arrested or simply disappearing. There were rumors of camps, of places where Jewish people were being sent, places for which no one returned. The worst part was the children. Ruth would see them in the streets, Jewish children who had been expelled from school, who had nowhere to go, nothing to do. They wandered in small groups, their faces confused and frightened, trying to understand why they were suddenly unwanted, why their friends no longer spoke to them, why adults looked at them with contempt or fear. Some of them she had taught. She would see them and one call out to comfort them, but she was afraid. Everyone was afraid. In November of 1938, everything changed again, and this time there was no pretending that things might get better. On the night of November 9th, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, organized mobs attacked Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues throughout Germany and Austria. In Vienna, Ruth heard the sound of breaking glass, of shouting and screaming, of fire crackling as synagogues burned. From their window, she could see the orange glow of flames against the night sky. Ruth and her mother huddled together in the darkness, not daring to light a candle, praying that the mob would not come to their building. They heard them in the street below, heard the sound of doors being kicked in, of furniture being thrown from windows, of people crying out in pain and terror. The next morning, the streets were covered in broken glass that glittered in the weak November sunlight like diamonds scattered across the pavement. Shop windows were smashed, their contents looted or destroyed. The synagogue on Temple Gas was a burned-out shell, its walls blackened, its roof collapsed, and everywhere Jewish men were being rounded up, arrested, loaded onto trucks and taken away. Ruth and her mother ventured out carefully, Ruth's cane tapping against a glass-strewn sidewalk, and what they saw made them both weep. Their community, their world, was being destroyed. It was in the days after Kristallnacht that Ruth met Greta Hoffmann. Greta was a non-Jewish Austrian woman, 42 years old, who had been a nurse before the war and now worked with a small underground network trying to help Jewish families escape Austria. She was tall and sturdy, with graying blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that were kind but also calculating, always assessing, always planning. She came to their apartment on a cold afternoon in late November, introduced by a mutual acquaintance who vouched for her trustworthiness. She sat at their small kitchen table, accepted a cup of weak tea, and told them that she was organizing transports to get Jewish children out of Austria to safety in England through a program that was being called the Kindertransport. The British government, she explained, had agreed to allow an unspecified number of Jewish children under the age of 17 to enter the country, provided that private citizens or organizations would guarantee to pay for their care and education. The children would travel without their parents, would be placed with foster families or in hostels, would be safe from the persecution that was consuming Austria and Germany. It was a desperate measure, a heartbreaking choice for parents to make, to send their children away to a foreign country where they didn't speak the language, to live with strangers, not knowing if they would ever see them again. But it was a chance at life. Greta looked at Ruth across the table, her eyes steady and serious, and asked if she would be willing to help. The network needed people who could speak English, who could help prepare the children for their journey, who could accompany them on the trains that would take them from Vienna to the ports where they would board ships for England. It was dangerous work. The Nazis were suspicious of anyone helping Jews escape. If Ruth were caught, she would be arrested, possibly sent to a camp. And given her disability, given that she was Jewish herself, she was already marked for persecution. Ruth didn't hesitate. She said yes. For the first time since the Anschluss, she felt something other than fear and despair. She felt purpose. She felt needed. The very thing that made her unfit in the eyes of the Nazis, her disability, her otherness, would become her disguise, her protection. Who would suspect a crippled Jewish woman of being capable of anything dangerous or heroic? The work began immediately. Greta brought Ruth lists of children whose parents had managed to secure spots on the transports. Ruth would visit their homes, meet with the families, help prepare the children for the journey. It was heartbreaking work. She would sit in cramped apartments with parents who were trying to be brave for their children, try to explain that this was an adventure, a wonderful opportunity, when everyone in the room knew it was a desperate act of survival. The children ranged in age from infants to teenagers. Some understood what was happening and were terrified. Others were too young to comprehend. excited about the idea of a train ride and a ship voyage. Ruth taught them basic English phrases. My name is... I am hungry. Where's the bathroom? Thank you. She helped their mothers pack their small suitcases, one suitcase per child, containing everything they would take into their new lives, a change of clothes, a photograph of their family, perhaps a small toy or book. She memorized their names, their faces, their stories. She promised their parents that she would watch over them, that she would make sure they got safely onto the trains, even though she knew that once the train left Vienna, they would be beyond her protection, in the hands of fate and the kindness of strangers. The first transport Ruth helped with left Vienna in December of 1938. There were 60 children on that train, ranging in age from 5 to 16. She accompanied them to the Westbahnhof, the West Railway Station, a grand building with high arched ceilings and platforms that stretched into the distance. The station was crowded with families saying goodbye, with children crying, with parents trying to maintain composure while their hearts were breaking. The Gestapo and SS officers were everywhere, checking papers, watching with cold eyes, looking for any excuse to stop the transport. Ruth moved through the crowd with her cane, her limp pronounced, her body language submissive and unthreatening. She had learned that her disability made her invisible to the Nazis in a particular way. They looked at her with disgust, yes, but also with dismissal. She was not worth their attention. She was already defeated, already broken. They didn't see her as a threat, and that invisibility became her greatest asset. She helped children onto the train, made sure they found seats, distributed the sandwiches and water that volunteers had prepared. She spoke to them in German and in her halting English, trying to calm their fears, trying to give them hope. And then the whistle blew, and the train began to move, and Ruth stood on the platform watching it disappear into the distance, watching 60 children leave their homes, their families, their entire world behind, heading toward an uncertain future that was still better than the certain death that awaited them if they stayed. Ruth went home that night and wept. Her mother held her while she sobbed, and she wept too, for all the children, for all the families torn apart, for the world that had gone mad. But the next day, Greta came with another list of names, and the work continued. Over the next months, Ruth helped with 6 more transports. Hundreds of children passed through her hands, each one a universe of hopes and fears, each one a life saved. But it was never enough. For every child who got a spot on a transport, there were dozens more who didn't. The British government had set limits, and the process of getting the necessary paperwork was slow and bureaucratic. Parents were desperate, begging, offering everything they had for a chance to save their children. And Ruth had to turn them away, had to tell them there was no room, no spot available, knowing that she was likely sentencing their children to death. In the spring of 1939, the situation in Vienna became even worse. Jewish people were being forced out of their homes, crowded into designated areas, their property confiscated. Food rations for Jews were reduced to starvation levels. Random arrests and deportations increased. Ruth and her mother were forced to move from their apartment on Taberstrasse to a single room in a building that housed 6 other Jewish families, all of them crammed together, sharing a single bathroom and kitchen. The room was tiny, barely large enough for 2 narrow beds and a small table. The walls were thin, and they could hear everything. Arguments, crying, prayers, the sounds of people trying to maintain their humanity in inhuman conditions. It was in this room, in May of 1939, that Greta came to Ruth with a proposal that would change everything. She sat on the edge of Ruth's bed, her face grave, and told her that the Kinder transport program was becoming increasingly difficult to operate. The Nazis were tightening restrictions, making it harder to get exit permits, subjecting the transports to more scrutiny. Several recent transports had been stopped at the border. The children turned back. The network needed to find alternative routes, unofficial routes, routes that didn't rely on Nazi cooperation. She told Ruth about a plan to smuggle children out of Austria through Czechoslovakia, which had been partially occupied by Germany, but still had some areas that were less tightly controlled. From there, the children could be moved through Poland and eventually to ports in the Baltic, where ships could take them to Sweden or England. It was dangerous, illegal, and if caught, everyone involved would be executed. and she wanted Ruth to lead one of these smuggling operations. Ruth stared at her, certain she had misunderstood. Her? Led a smuggling operation? She was a disabled Jewish woman who could barely walk without a cane, who had no experience with anything remotely clandestine or dangerous. How could she possibly lead children across borders, through Nazi-controlled territory, to safety? Greta smiled a sad, knowing smile, and said that was exactly why Ruth was perfect for the job. Her disability made her seem harmless, unthreatening. The Nazis had a blind spot when it came to people they considered inferior. They couldn't imagine that someone like Ruth could be capable of resistance, of cunning, of courage. She would be hiding in plain sight, dismissed and overlooked, which would allow her to do what needed to be done. Greta had already identified 23 children who desperately needed to get out. Their parents were either already arrested or in immediate danger. These children had no spots on official transports, no legal way to escape. Without this smuggling operation, they would certainly die. She had contact along the route who would provide safe houses, forge documents, and transportation. But she needed someone to accompany the children, to keep them together, to make the countless small decisions that would mean the difference between success and disaster. She needed someone the children would trust, someone who could speak multiple languages, someone who was smart and resourceful. She needed Ruth. Ruth looked at her mother, who was sitting at their small table mending a shirt by candlelight. Sarah looked back at her daughter, her face lined with worry and exhaustion, and she nodded. She understood what Greta was asking, understood the danger, and she was giving Ruth permission to risk her life to save these children. Ruth turned back to Greta and said yes. The preparation took 2 weeks. Ruth memorized routes, safe house locations, contact names, and code phrases. She studied forged documents that identified her as a Catholic social worker transporting orphans to a church-run facility in Poland. The documents were good, professionally made, but they wouldn't hold up under serious scrutiny. The plan relied on moving quickly, on not attracting attention, on the assumption that Nazi officials wouldn't look too closely at a group of children being led by a crippled woman. The children were brought to Ruth in small groups over several days, hidden in the basement of a bombed-out building in the Leopoldstadt district. They ranged in age from 4 to 13. Some came with their parents, who said tearful goodbyes and pressed photographs and small treasures into their children's hands. Others came alone, already orphaned, brought by relatives or neighbors who were risking their own lives to save them. Ruth learned their names, their ages, their fears. She told them that they were going on a journey, that they needed to be very brave and very quiet, that she would keep them safe. The youngest was a little girl named Hannah, just 4 years old, with dark curls and enormous brown eyes that seemed to take up half her face. She clutched a worn, stuffed rabbit and didn't speak, hadn't spoken since her parents had been arrested 2 weeks earlier. The oldest was a boy named David, 13, who tried to act tough and unafraid, but whose hands shook when he thought no one was looking. There were siblings, twin girls named Leah and Rachel, 8 years old, who held hands constantly and finished each other's sentences. There was a boy named Jacob who had asthma and carried an inhaler that was nearly empty. There was a girl named Miriam who was blind, who would need to be guided every step of the way. 23 children, 23 lives in Ruth's hands. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but she couldn't let them see her fear. She had to be strong, confident, capable. She had to be the adult they could trust when their entire world had betrayed them. They left Vienna on a rainy night in early June 1939. The city was dark, the blackout regulations in effect. Only occasional streetlights casting pools of yellow light on the wet pavement. They moved through the streets in small groups, trying not to attract attention, making their way to a warehouse near the Danube where a truck was waiting. The truck was old and battered, used for transporting vegetables, and it smelled of rotting cabbage and earth. The children climbed into the back, and Ruth climbed in after them, her leg aching from the exertion, her cane clutched in her hand. The driver was a man named Franz, a non-Jewish Austrian who was part of Greta's network. He was risking his life to help them, and Ruth never learned why. He didn't speak much, just nodded at her, closed the back of the truck, and started driving. They huddled together in the darkness. The children pressed against each other for warmth and comfort. Ruth could hear them breathing, could hear little Hannah whimpering softly, could hear David trying to comfort the younger ones with whispered reassurances. The journey to the Czech border took 4 hours, 4 hours of terror as the truck bounced over rough roads, as they heard checkpoints and had to hold their breath while Franz showed his papers, as they prayed that no one would look in the back. At one checkpoint, an SS officer did open the back door, shining a flashlight into the darkness. The children froze, and Ruth stepped forward, leaning heavily on her cane, and explained in her most servile voice that she was transporting orphans to a Catholic facility, that these poor children had lost their parents and were being taken to safety. The officer looked at her with disgust, looked at the children with indifference, and waved them through. They were beneath his notice, not worth his time. They crossed into Czechoslovakia just before dawn. Franz drove them to a farmhouse outside a small village, where a Czech family was waiting. They gave them food, real food, bread and cheese and milk, and the children ate like they were starving, which they were. They rested for a few hours, and then they had to move again. The plan was to keep moving, to never stay in one place long enough to be discovered, to make their way north and east through a series of safe houses until they reached the Baltic coast. The journey took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of constant fear, of close calls, of moments when Ruth was certain they would be caught. They traveled by truck, by cart, once by boat across a river in the middle of the night. They hid in barns, in cellars, in the back rooms of churches. They were helped by an underground network of people, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who risked everything to move them along the route. Some of them Ruth never even saw, just heard their voices in the darkness, felt their hands guiding them to the next hiding place. The children were extraordinary. They endured hunger, cold, fear, exhaustion, and they rarely complained. They learned to be silent when silence was necessary, to move quickly when speed was essential, to trust Ruth completely. She became their mother, their teacher, their protector. She told them stories to distract them from their fear, taught them songs in English to help them learn the language, held them when they cried for their parents. Hannah, the little girl who didn't speak, attached herself to Ruth, holding on to her skirt with one hand and her stuffed rabbit with the other. She slept curled against Ruth, and gradually, over the days, she began to make small sounds, then words, then sentences. The first thing she said to Ruth was, "I'm scared," and Ruth held her and told her that being scared was okay, that she was scared too, but that they would be brave together. David, the 13-year-old boy, became Ruth's lieutenant, helping her keep the younger children organized, carrying the little ones when they were too tired to walk, standing watch while Ruth slept. He never complained about his own fear or exhaustion, just kept doing what needed to be done. Ruth saw him grow up during those 3 weeks, saw the child disappear and a young man emerge. Miriam, the blind girl, was one of the bravest. She couldn't see the dangers they faced, but she could sense them, could feel the tension in the air. She never panicked, never slowed them down, just held on to Ruth's arm and trusted her to guide her. She sang sometimes, softly, old Hebrew songs that her grandmother taught her, and her voice in the darkness was a reminder of beauty in a world of ugliness. Jacob's asthma got worse as they traveled, the stress and exertion triggering attacks that left him gasping for breath. His inhaler ran out after the first week, and Ruth had to find other ways to help him. Breathing exercises, keeping him calm, finding places where the air was cleaner. There were nights when Ruth thought they would lose him, when his breathing became so labored that she was certain he wouldn't survive until morning. But he did. He survived because he was determined to, because he refused to give up. The twins, Leah and Rachel, created their own little world, speaking to each other in a private language that only they understood, playing quiet games with pebbles and sticks, finding joy in the smallest things. They reminded Ruth that childhood persists even in the worst circumstances, that the human spirit finds ways to play and laugh even in the face of death. They had several close calls. Once, they were hiding in a barn when Nazi soldiers came to search the farm. They buried themselves in hay, the children holding their breath, Ruth's hand over Hannah's mouth to keep her from crying out. The soldiers were so close Ruth could hear their boots on the wooden floor, could hear them talking and laughing. They stabbed the hay with their bayonets, and Ruth felt the blade pass within inches of her leg. But they didn't find them. They left, and Ruth waited until nightfall before moving on. Another time, they were traveling in a cart covered with a tarp when they were stopped at a checkpoint. The guard was suspicious, wanted to know what was under the tarp. The driver, a Polish farmer who was part of the network, told him it was potatoes, but the guard wasn't satisfied. He started to pull back the tarp, and Ruth knew they were finished. But then David did something incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. He coughed loudly, a horrible hacking cough, and then said in German that he was sick, that they all were sick, that they had typhus. The guard jumped back, terrified of contagion, and waved them through without looking further. David had saved them all with a lie and a fake cough. They finally reached the Baltic coast in late June, arriving at a small fishing village in what is now Lithuania. The village was gray and windswept, the houses small and weathered, the smell of fish and salt water everywhere. They were taken to a house near the harbor, where they waited for 3 days for a fishing boat that would take them across the Baltic Sea to Sweden. Those 3 days were agony. They were so close to safety, but they weren't safe yet. Every sound made them jump. Every knock on the door made them fear discovery. The boat finally came on a foggy morning, a small fishing vessel that looked barely seaworthy. The captain was a Swedish man who spoke broken German and asked no questions. They loaded the children onto the boat, all 23 of them, plus Ruth, crowding into the small cabin and the hold. The sea was rough, the boat pitching and rolling, and most of the children got seasick, vomiting into buckets, miserable and frightened. The crossing took 18 hours. 18 hours of cold and wet and fear, of wondering if the boat would sink, if they would be spotted by a German patrol boat, if they had come this far only to die within sight of freedom. But they made it. As the sun was setting, they saw the Swedish coast, rocky and beautiful, and the children started to cry, not from fear this time, but from relief. They landed at a small port, and Swedish officials were waiting for them. They had been alerted by the underground network, and they were prepared. They took them to a reception center, gave them hot food and clean clothes and beds with real mattresses. The children were examined by doctors, their names and information recorded, arrangements made for their care. Ruth stayed with them for 2 more days, making sure each child was settled, that they understood what was happening, that they knew they were safe. And then she had to say goodbye. It was one of the hardest things she had ever done. These children had become her children, and she was leaving them, sending them on to foster families in children's homes, to new lives in a country where they didn't speak the language, where they knew no one. But they were alive. They were safe. And that was what mattered. Hannah clung to Ruth, crying, begging her not to leave. Ruth held her and told her that she was so brave, so strong, that she was going to have a wonderful life, that she would never forget her parents, but that she would be happy again. Ruth gave her the wooden cane, the cane that had been with her through everything, and told Hannah to keep it to remember her by, to remember that being different, being broken, doesn't mean being weak. David shook Ruth's hand like a man, his eyes dry but his voice breaking as he thanked her. Miriam hugged Ruth and whispered that she would pray for her every day. The twins gave Ruth a drawing they had made, a picture of all of them together, stick figures holding hands. Jacob gave Ruth his empty inhaler, saying he wanted her to have something to remember him by. Ruth left Sweden 2 days later, traveling back to the underground network to Vienna. The journey back was faster, but no less dangerous. She was alone this time, which made it easier in some ways, harder in others. She didn't have to worry about keeping children safe, but she also didn't have their presence to give her purpose, to distract her from her own fear. She returned to Vienna in mid-July 1939 to find that things had gotten even worse in her absence. More arrests, more deportations, more restrictions. Her mother was still alive, still in their single room, but she had aged years in the weeks Ruth had been gone. When Sarah saw her daughter, she wept with relief, having been certain Ruth was dead. Ruth told her mother about the journey, about the children, about getting all 23 of them to safety. Sarah held Ruth's hands and told her she was proud of her, that Ruth's father would have been proud of her. And then she told Ruth that Greta had been arrested. The Gestapo had raided one of the safe houses, had found documents, had traced them back to Greta. She had been taken to Gestapo headquarters and hadn't been seen since. The network was in disarray. people going into hiding, operations suspended. Ruth was devastated. Greta had saved so many lives, had risked everything, and now she was gone. Ruth later learned that Greta died in Ravensbrück concentration camp in 1942, one of thousands of women who resisted the Nazis and paid with their lives. She was a hero, and the world barely knows her name. Without Greta, without the network, Ruth couldn't do any more smuggling operations. But she continued to help in smaller ways, hiding people in their room, sharing their meager food, passing messages, doing whatever she could. Ruth and her mother survived in Vienna until 1941, when they were finally deported to their Seienstadt, the ghetto and concentration camp in Czechoslovakia. Their Seienstadt was a place of slow death, of starvation and disease and despair. Ruth's mother died there in the winter of 1942 of typhus and malnutrition and a broken heart. Ruth held her as she died, and Sarah's last words to her daughter were that Ruth had to survive, that she had to live to tell the story of what happened, to bear witness. Ruth survived their Seienstadt. She didn't know how. Luck, stubbornness, the memory of those 23 children giving her a reason to keep living. She was liberated by Soviet forces in May of 1945, weighing less than 80 pounds, her body ravaged by disease and starvation, but alive. After the war, Ruth emigrated to the United States, to New York City, where she lived in a small apartment in Washington Heights, a neighborhood full of German Jewish refugees. She worked as a translator, never married, never had children of her own. But she spent her life trying to find out what had happened to the 23 children she had smuggled out of Austria. It took years, decades, but Ruth found them. Not all of them, but most. Hannah became a teacher in London, married, had 3 children of her own. She still had Ruth's cane, kept it in her home as a reminder. David became a doctor in America, specializing in pediatrics, dedicating his life to helping children. Miriam became a musician, a pianist, performing all over the world despite her blindness. Jacob survived his asthma, became an engineer, helped build bridges and buildings. The twins, Leah and Rachel, stayed together their entire lives, living in the same town in Sweden, raising their families side by side. Not all of them survived the war. 3 of the 23 died, 1 from illness, 2 in accidents. But 20 of them lived, grew up, had families, had careers, had lives. 20 lives that would have been extinguished if not for that desperate journey in the summer of 1939. They called her unfit. The Nazis, with their obsession with physical perfection, with their belief in a master race, looked at Ruth and saw someone who had no right to exist, someone whose life had no value. They were wrong. Ruth's life had value. Her disability. The thing they despised became her disguise, her protection, her strength. She was underestimated, dismissed, overlooked, and that allowed her to do what needed to be done. Ruth lived to be 97 years old, and she still walked with a limp, still needed a cane, though it was a modern one, aluminum instead of wood. Her body was old and tired, marked by the years in camps, by the hardship she endured. But she was there. She survived. And more importantly, 23 children survived because she refused to accept the label of unfit, refused to believe that her disability made her less than human, refused to stay silent and passive in the face of evil. The world tried to tell Ruth she was worthless, that she should accept her fate, that someone like her couldn't make a difference. But she proved them wrong. One person, even a disabled Jewish woman with a cane, can change the world, can save lives, can be a hero. Ruth thought about those children often, about the journey they took together, about the fear and the courage and the desperate hope that kept them moving forward. She thought about their faces, their voices, their small hands holding on to hers. She thought about the parents who trusted her with their most precious treasures, who said goodbye not knowing if they would ever see their children again. Most of them didn't. Most of them died in the camps, in the gas chambers, in the mass graves. But their children lived. Their children survived to have children of their own, and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Hundreds of people alive today because of that journey, because of those 3 weeks in the summer of 1939. That was Ruth's legacy. Not wealth or fame or recognition, but life. 23 children who became 20 adults who became hundreds of descendants. A whole forest of life growing from seeds planted in the darkest time, watered with tears and blood and desperate courage. They called her unfit. But Ruth was fit for the only thing that truly matters. She was fit to love, to care, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. She was fit to be human in a time when humanity was under attack. She was fit to resist, to refuse, to say no to evil even when evil seemed all-powerful. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything